Well, yeah, I work with Pavee Point Traveller and Roma Centre, and we're a national Traveller and Roma rights organisation. We were established in 1985, and essentially it's about promoting the attainment of human rights for travellers in Roma in a number of different spheres: education, health, accommodation, employment, and so on. One of the big battles we had in Pavee Point was challenging the racist ideology that we travellers were in some way a broken people who needed to be fixed by the majority population. So in other words, we didn't have a culture, we didn't have an identity, we didn't have a language, we didn't have a history. But of course we have all of that. But the prevailing analysis for centuries on the island was that we were a failed settled people who just need to be civilized and normalized by the state. That racist ideology prevailed for many centuries. And it wasn't really until the 1st of March 2017, our then Taoiseach Enda Kenny in the Oireachtas made a very profound statement recognising the distinct ethnic identity of travellers. So that was a really historic moment in our struggle. But of course, the recognition of ethnicity is not a panacea. It's not going to resolve the individual and the institutionalised racism that travellers continue to experience. And that will need a different policy response to address those issues. Now, of course, that individual and institutional racism, we can see the manifestations of that on a whole number of fronts. For example, we can see it in the health inequalities, that I as a traveller man live 15 years less than a settled man. A traveller woman lives on average 12 years less. Our infant mortality rate is 4 times higher than the national average. You know, only 3% of travellers live to be 65 years of age. We can see in the education that only 13% of travellers complete secondary education compared to 97% in the majority population. We can see it in the disproportionate representation of travellers in prisons. In fact, we have more travellers in prison than we do in universities. We can see it in the 85% unemployment rate. These are all examples of the ongoing institutionalised racism that travellers experience. Now, of course, this inequality and racism, as experienced by travellers, it didn't come about as a result of COVID. It existed, as we all know, well before COVID. And this has been well documented by our Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, the ESRI, Economic and Social Research Institute, and indeed various international human rights bodies. So in other words, it's not just Pavee Point is saying it. But what COVID did do, COVID did amplify and reinforce these inequalities. For example, we have, travellers are disproportionately represented in the homeless population. Even though we only make up, less than 1% of the total population, we actually constitute 15% of the homeless population. So as you can see, we are disproportionately represented. We have thousands of traveller families, men, women and children living on unofficial sites or living on official sites that lack the basic essentials. So even during COVID, many travel families couldn't meet the basic public health requirements in terms of social distancing, in terms of washing hands, because they were living in overcrowded conditions, didn't have access to sanitation and water supply in the middle of a public health emergency. So that's what I mean about amplifying and reinforcing the inequality as experienced by travellers. How am I optimistic? I don't know, to be quite frank with you, if this will be a new beginning, if lessons will be learned in terms of how we go about, coming out of the pandemic and constructing a more fair, more pluralist and a more inclusive society. I don't mean to be too negative, but I'm afraid I don't see any evidence of that, and I'm not very optimistic. And I'll give you an example of that. The Irish state, people will know that the European Commission have put in place a 750 billion recovery package for the European Union, and that would be distributed among the 27 member states. Ireland had to submit its National Resilience and Recovery Plan to the European Commission to draw down its part of the funding. And we made a submission to the state's National Recovery and Resilience Plan. Nowhere in that plan does it make any reference to racism, to ethnic minorities, or to poverty reduction. Now, maybe I'm being very simplistic, but if you use that as an example, it doesn't really give you much optimism. And I would agree with a lot of what Kathleen has said there about, I think essential public services have become privatised, have become commodified, motivated by profit. And another example of that would be in 2020, 503 million was spent by the Irish state on the HAP programme alone, going to private landlords. It's an incredible amount of money, 503 million to private landlords through HAP and RAS. Money that could have been and should have been used for public house building, social and affordable housing. Our strategy, again, that's just another example of the neoliberalism model, where we are looking to and dependent on the private sector to address the problems. And of course, we know that hasn't worked. If anything, the housing situation has grown from crisis to crisis. But that's just an example. In 2015, of the 31 local authorities in the state, between them, they only constructed 75 houses. That's an absolutely, I don't know, it's incredible. So again, that's just to reinforce the point about this neoliberal model and privatizing and commodifying essential services such as education, health, you know, how deep is your pocket sort of thing. But the last point I would make in racism, for me is inherent in capitalism, it's inherent in colonialism, and it's inherent in imperialism. And I don't think we can address racism adequately or effectively without addressing all of the other issues. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.